So yeah, here I'm Jarrad. I'm from Status. We work on a hybrid mobile browser and DApp browser and instant messenger. It's built entirely on top of the Ethereum stack, essentially. So we're using Whisper and dark messaging, and the idea is that you're running a full node on your mobile device, and you can access dApps through this. But today, I'm kind of here to talk a bit about post-web systems and basically the web today and what hypertext is and where we go from here. I know it's late in the afternoon, so we're all pretty tired. Don't worry, this is pretty like lightweight. Just lots of nice colors and images and that sort of thing. So it should be all good. Click. Next slide, please. Cool. So, so basically, this is Mosaic. This is one of the sort of precursor to Netscape, and it's kind of like the first web browser. It's quite interesting because pretty much the web browser back then, 30 years ago, pretty much looks exactly the same as our browsers today, at least on desktop. Cool. The difference being is now we're doing it on our mobile devices. On the far right, left, sorry, image is basically a web view, and you have the back and forward buttons. You can get an address bar and that sort of thing. So ultimately, the user experience and the UX hasn't particularly changed that much. And it's kind of interesting to think about, because basically we're doing all this kind of crazy, interesting things on the blockchain side. Like we're creating things like Swarm or IPFS, creating decentralized file storage. We're trying to move, quote, server-side logic away and put it into this weird smart contract thing. But then on top of that, we're just kind of using WebKit or just the existing version of the web. And it's a little unclear to me is what that looks like, in the next 30 years. If we're moving to personal computing devices, which are our smartphones, is that where it ends, and is that where we're just going to continue using? I'm not sure if that is the case. Here's a picture of LeapMotion's Project North Star. This is a mixed reality device or augmented reality device, and the construction of it is actually open source as well, which is kind of cool. But this is something that exists today. So if you can imagine in maybe 10, 15 years time, with the current trends in terms of battery advancements, the trends in mobile bandwidth, and this thing getting a whole lot smaller, hopefully, then we might actually start wearing our phones on our faces. And at that point in time, we have to start revisiting how we actually do our user experience, and what does the web actually look like. I don't know if anyone's had much chance to work with virtual reality yet, but bits of paper or these sort of planes don't really work all that well. This is just Meta AR's concept image, kind of cool. But there's also another interesting divide, which is currently the web is contained purely within our devices. We're essentially looking onto the digital world through a window. But if we start having these mixed reality devices, then the web the line between the digital world and the real world is going to start blurring quite a lot. And again, maybe Windows and Pages are not necessarily the right way to go about this. Perhaps we start seeing a lot more augmented objects, or you start seeing other just completely virtual objects living in this same three-dimensional space that we're in. Both of these pictures are from this little crowd-funded clip called Hyperreality. Definitely worth watching, because it's not necessarily dystopian, but it's very predictive of how things would currently go, given our current trends in tech. So the question here is, do pages really make sense? And really, like, why is it called hypertext anyway now? Because most of what we use for the web is essentially an application sandbox and application delivery. And that got me thinking about like these pages and wondering, well, what is the web anyway, and how do we actually get here? And so I kind of want to quickly go over a quick sort of history of the web. And the reason for this is because I won't go into too much detail of the individual characters, but they all essentially have some kind of contribution, which I'll try and summarize towards the end in terms of an unrealized vision of that does not exist in our current web. And with most things, it begins with God. Well, here's Bible. It is basically the first sort of large text or document that's been severely annotated within itself and self-referential. So you can start to think of these things as like hyperlinks. And then fast forward to 1737, we had our boy Andrew Ramsey. Basically, he was a Freemason and set an objective to create this universal encyclopedia, basically describing the internet in some kind of form. And that seemed like a really good idea to Paul Ottley, who ended up actually creating a completely analog version of the internet. He had his UBR, which essentially was a series of index cards all filed away. It's pretty crazy. It started off, I think, in 1895 with roughly 400,000 index cards. And towards its end at 1934, he had accumulated over 15 million of these cards and had like a whole bunch of workers on there. And he also had this other concept of a knowledge city, which I think was going to be for the League of Nations, I'm not sure. But it was called the Mundaneum. And it's basically, you could go to these terminals and you could like look up this information and people would find it for you. Then we come to the era or the coming decades of global brains. We had Pierre talking about the noosphere, in which humanity was creating a thinking membrane that was going to cover the entire planet. And that was roughly around 1920. You had H.G. Wells now starting to talk about the world brain. Really interesting read. And yeah, it's the same sort of ideas. And then you had Charles Carter towards the end of his sort of life saying, you know, man would no longer need documentation if he was assimilated into a being that become omniscient in the manner of God himself. It's also kind of interesting because back in 1883, he was basically saying, yo, those future people, they're totally going to have desktops with broadband. Pretty profound thinking from back then. Fast forwarding a little bit more, we start to get to things that actually look closer to the web. We have, I'm mispronouncing this probably, but Vannevar Bush had a conceptual, basically got frustrated with the existing technology today, so he gave up on trying to build anything, and instead he just tried to think of what a perfect system was. And he created an essay called As We May Think. Absolutely one of the most profound sort of documents that's influenced a lot of the web. Highly recommend reading it. And he had this conceptual machinery called Memex, and it has a lot of these ideas of associative linking, hyperlinking, all these sort of networked texts and that sort of thing. He also imagined that, you know, like you would have a camera on there and you'd be documenting what you did and all kinds of crazy stuff. You can also see some like initial ideas of like tablets, which is kind of cool. Then we got Douglas Engelbart, who was heavily influenced by Bush, and he started to think about how we can actually use computers to solve our collective problems and these more and more complex problems that we wouldn't be able to solve with our current technology. And so he created a framework called Augmenting Human Intellect, and then he basically gave birth to like modern computing. He created it, and that's in the form of NLS being demoed in the mother of all demos, and it's pretty much where everything came from. He even invented the mouse, you know. Incredibly intelligent person and really interesting conceptual thinker. Roughly around the same time, you had Ted Nelson on the scene, who actually coined the term hypertext. And he has the, quote, longest-running vaporware, which is product Xanadu. But Xanadu actually has some really interesting ideas that have never been fully realized. Ted actually worked with Andy in creating HES, the hypertext editing system. And this is basically it was actually the first word processor, but it also had hyperlinking capabilities within it as well. And they were completely unaware of NLS at the time. Then Douglas Engelbart kind of passed the torch on to sort of Alan Kay in terms of Xerox PARC. And he pioneered this whole windowing graphical user interface design. He came up with object-oriented programming, Dynabooks, with, a precursor to laptops and tablets, and Smalltalk, which is a really interesting way of programming where the code and the UI can all be kind of modified on the fly. And it's a concept that you don't actually really see that much of, except for maybe in Lisps to a smaller extent. And then we got our golden boy, Tim Berners-Lee. He basically invented the modern World Wide Web as we have today. He created the URLs, HTTPs, and HTML, but as an HTML derivative. But there are some problems with the current state of the web, and a lot of it has to do with ephemerality of data in particular. I don't know how many times you've searched the web and you've come across like a dead link, for example. The same with data processing. Sometimes you can find that data, but you can no longer view it or access it because the ability to process it, the software to process it, is no longer in existence, which is called bit rot. In the current version of the web, you also have opaque one-way links. So links are embedded in the document, and you can't really get access to those or see them except for being on that particular page. And I also wanted to talk about this page analogy in siloed windowed applications. It's also it's pretty interesting actually how that happens. Basically in NLS or Engelbart's work, they had this concept of a page, but all of the text was actually networked underneath. And then he kind of showed that to Kay and was like, yeah, this is like network text. And he goes, oh, it's paper. And he's like, nah. And then Steve Jobs came along and basically was like, oh, this is great. This is like a desktop and paper. And Kay is like, well, no, it's not actually. Like all of this is like a completely different UI. You can pull it apart. It's all networked. It's all linked underneath. Then Bill Gates came along and appropriated Jobs' work and kind of popularized this sort of siloed application. And so we never really got a chance to spread this particular idea out, that we could actually compose software out of different views and out of different modular components. It's re-emerged in certain ways, but it's never been like an underlying principle of how we've done computing. Anyway, so all of those people have basically contributed to a large list of wants or desires in what would be the idealized version of the web. Firstly, if we're going to create a new version or new metadata system, it needs to subsume the existing web. So basically what that means is all we really need to do is kind of pull links out of documents as we browse them and separate them. One of the key features is that none of these systems had the links in there except for Tim Berners-Lee, but that was actually one of the features that got web adopted in the first place, is because it was so easy to author. So anything that we have to create needs to allow for the creation of content, the linking of it, and recomposing of content into new content as easy as possible. Data should, in the current web, that this is the case. You have to connect to a server. Things like IPFS and Swarm are making huge leaps in terms of solving this particular problem. Again, data is a first-class citizen. That means that you're not going to have any special rights as an author once you've deployed that data onto the web, and everyone else that's using the web has exactly the same rights to that data. Which means you can then create new versions of it. You can create new links on any other kind of data, and you get this really interesting sort of social space of local knowledge that develops around it. Yeah, mentioned that. Yeah, I mean, links themselves should also be immutable, and they can have multiple in and out references. It doesn't have to be just a simple one-way link. You can create links that actually have types or attributes as well. So at the moment, we just have this one particular link, and you click it, and you go to the next place. This would allow you to do other interesting ways of linking. Perhaps you can imagine a link that requires ETH, or you can stake it. So it's a signal that that link is more valuable to somebody, for example. Later on, you can actually turn these links into views themselves, which I'll talk about in a bit. Yeah, I mean, so a link should be attributable to a user. If you create a link, it should be attached to an author and ID. Links are transactional, so while they're also attributable to a user, they're also attributable to a point in time. A link should be actually directed and bidirectional and visible to all. So currently, right now, it's opaque. You can't actually see a link outside of it, and if you can't see what's linking to you. Okay, there's if your web browser gives some kind of referrer and the server says, okay, record that backlink, then you get some visibility on it as the server, but as a user, you have no idea what's linking to that content that you're currently viewing. Yeah, all new versions of any kind of data should have a link to its past, so everything is retraceable in some step. And there should be a layer 2 system in terms of subscribing to blacklink lists voluntarily if you don't want to see certain kinds of link types or links. And this idea of views, which is I mentioned before, but is essentially, you can think of it kind of like CSS or kind of like Grease Monkey in terms of being able to overlay other kinds of data onto other data, and that somehow gives some kind of transformation. But you can actually take that much, much further, and you can do some really, really interesting things with that. If you had a chance to play around with Smalltalk, you'll get a much better understanding. Okay, so I mean, what this gets us, basically, I think one of the most powerful things here is this idea of democratization of search. If you're doing decentralized search, then you have some degree of provability to show that things are being linked in a certain way. And that data is open to anybody. Like right now, you have other entities out there that are holding this and creating monopolies around their data, and this would make it completely open. You also get this idea of local knowledge mapping. In certain areas, you'd actually be able to have communities who are very knowledgeable in a certain space actually structure information in very unique and interesting ways. There's also this sort of social link space, because not only can other people create links on your content on your website, you could also imagine sites that are siloed right now, such as Reddit. They could actually live as a link type, and you could actually get comments on web pages if you so desire, without having to go off to a separate website and then back. You get self-describing data types. Gotcha. So basically with this, right now you can solve bit rot by just having a view or a link in terms of pulling down the codec for a video and the video itself, and so it automatically executes and it plays without you having to download any software or have any extra plugins or extensions in the actual browser itself. And you can do more complex data structures. So you can imagine actually taking Git objects and deploying them into this structure. But not only that, you actually get to take along the issues, you get to take along the pull requests, you get to see in history how the project's developed, and you can actually go and view that in your browser. You could even include DAO or any decision making that's included in that, including funds, and you can see how all of that worked, and you can navigate it quite effectively. And if we do it as a directed hypergraph, then we could even describe complex networks. And perhaps this gets us close to maybe a conscious global brain. And this other idea of the 3D web, all this post-symbolic communication, would actually allow us to encode abstract concepts into objects themselves. And this is absolutely transformative for learning. You can imagine actually having intuitive objects that you can play around with that teach you some kind of formal physics or formal mathematics. Yeah, and we can rebuild it. I'm out of time, so directed hypergraph, that's what we need to do. And there's a possible implementation in terms of that you can actually deploy in smart contracts that would actually do this really well. It's basically get rid of hyper edges and vertices, treat them all like atoms, have ins and outs for different address types. Yeah, so I mean, if you're interested in doing applied research on this, please contact me because I'd love to work with you. Anyway, thanks.